Meeting to order. The meeting, as it states in the agenda, is committee business, and I know first we have a motion. Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Or should I say bona prima-di, Mr. Chair. I have filed, put on paper a notice of a motion last week. Can I read it out, sir?
Yeah, read it out and go to your remarks.
Thank you. Whereas the sixth report of the Standing Committee on Finance entitled the Canada Revenue Agency Tax Avoidance and Tax Evasion Recommended Action calls on the federal government to review the Income Tax Act and report back to the committee by June 30th, 2017, whereas the Department of Finance is conducting a review of the Income Tax Act that is ongoing and not yet complete, that the Standing Committee on Finance defer its hearings on the study undertaken following the motion adopted on June 16th, 2016, until after the federal government has completed its review and reported back to the committee.
Go ahead.
We can speak to that. I will speak to that. Firstly, obviously, we had asked in our sixth report on the Standing Committee of Finance for the federal government to review the Income Tax Act. Second of all, there will be an upcoming budget. Obviously, there may or may not be measures in there that the government may want to undertake. So it'd be better to conduct any sort of review after the budget. And thirdly, from a competitive standpoint, we don't know yet what will happen with the new Trump administration. The new administration, any sort of tax changes that administration will undertake, and what that means in terms of our competitiveness, in terms of how we look at our tax system. So I think when you connect all the dots together, there's good reason to defer or to move this study into a later date. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, the floor is open. Who's on? Any further discussion? Ski.
Just a quick question. In the motion, you mentioned the fact that the Minister of Finance is studying, conducting a review of the Income Tax Act that is ongoing and not yet complete. I'll begin again. So in the motion, I read, whereas the Department of Finance is conducting a review of the Income Tax Act that is ongoing and not yet complete. Might the committee be made aware of how this study is going and what exactly the focus is? What is the angle that the department is using in the context of this review?
Thank you. Merci beaucoup pour cette question.
Thank you very much for your question.
For you. What I will say with this report that we undertook for tax avoidance and tax evasion measures, and the recommendation we made it calls on the federal government to review the Income Tax Act and report back by the committee by June 30, 2008. I don't have a specific update as of yet on that. Okay.
En fait, je posais la question parce que pour l'instant.
I was asking the question because all I've heard about it is that what is presently being studied are the tax expenditures. But I would like to know if the study undertaken by the department goes beyond that and deals, for example, with the complexity of the system.
Everything I've read is my understanding is it's reviewing the tax expenditures, and that's my understanding of the scope.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Speaker, we are very concerned with that, because it's not because the minister is doing his job that we cannot do our own job. And I think it's part of our committee, as member of parliament, to listen to witness. And unfortunately, what we have seen last week is a proof, without a shadow of a doubt, that the government sometimes takes decision without asking the right question to the right people, because no one there who were witness has been consulted by the Minister of Finance, even if they were all directly linked to the mortgage business. And they were, first and foremost, the one who had to deal with that, and the minister failed to recognize them and failed to consult them. So if the minister want to make some analysis on their own, well, that's their job. Maybe don't disagree with that. I'm not the one who will tell the minister don't consult anyone. But I think that as member of parliament, as member of this committee, it belongs to the committee to welcome witness and to be sure that all Canadian voice will be heard correctly here in this committee. And especially when we're talking about a review of so many tax credit, we have seen, without making too much politics about that, but we have seen that it took 2 months to the government to, at the end of the day, recognize that it will not be a good idea to have tax on healthcare protection and dental protection. Dental, not dental, dental protection. So, sorry. So I wish that the government will open the door to have consultation here in this committee.
Any further discussion? Go ahead, Francisco.
I want to just to rebut and just to make sure it's on the record that, you know, our government has been consulting with Canadians and will always consult with Canadians. Today we saw the growth panel release a number of reports how we can grow our economy, strengthen our economy, grow the middle class, improve the lives of all Canadians. We will always do that, Mr. Deltel, and I don't think our government needs a lesson from the other side on consulting with Canadians and looking back at the past 10 years of the Conservative government with regards to the main decisions that they undertook. So I do have to correct that, sir. With regards to this committee, you know, on the housing study, we've called a number of witnesses that have given a number of or different stories or different dynamics in terms of how they feel some of the decisions were or were not made. We want to be prudent with regards to the housing market with any measures that we've taken, and that's what we'll continue to do, sir.
Mr. Alves.
You know, at first glance, what the motion here proposes, you know, I had some of my own concerns originally when we talked about this, whether or not we were the perfect format for this. That being said, we have seen over the past weeks when we ask questions about which tax benefit or tax credit that the Liberal government will go after in order to be able to balance its books, we hear radio silence until Canadians get alarmed, and whether it be tax and health benefits and whatnot, it seems that the government is less than forthcoming and being transparent. Perhaps if we received more of a substantive response in the House of Commons, we wouldn't be so concerned about whether or not we're getting the proper information. So I'm, while I understand the member opposite, and he makes you know, a good argument from that perspective, on the second perspective, you know, we set out on this course, and suddenly the government is backtracking massively, putting the brakes on a motion that was agreed to, I think, by everyone. And I think that's really unfortunate. It says more that either the government has something to hide, or they want to go ahead with their reshuffling the deck on tax expenditures for their own budget without any input. And if that's the case, then we will probably eventually have witnesses coming in here saying they weren't consulted, and that the government will act without any kind of sense of public input. And yes, it's fine to say that the government is consulting and you have an economic panel, but they're not the government. They're an advisory group. This is Parliament. I think this is the People's House. We voted originally to look into this, and I find it quite strange that the government now is applying the brakes so hard because it does not want this committee to take a look into tax expenditures and how Canadians relate to them.
Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, that's very interesting, those statements. Let me begin and start to actually correct them, because in fact there is nowhere that this says we are no longer interested or hiding behind anything. In fact, this is a prudent use of our time. This committee has a number of issues and things that we will be studying, and what this is actually the government is listening to exactly the recommendations that this committee made during the CRA study, as well as pre-budget consultations where we heard testimony from witnesses saying that the tax system is too complicated and that needs to be reviewed. The suggestion that this somehow is a reaction to the hyperbole that the opposition has been stating in the House, where we clearly said that taxing dental and health benefits was not in our mandate, but the Conservatives can't seem to get over that fact because they don't have much to talk about these days, I guess. So instead of actually doing the work, we are saying, let's be prudent with our time. Let's wait and see the report that comes out or the details of the department, what they're looking at. And then this committee, as we do with legislation, and we'll study it, call in witnesses, and make recommendations. So the only ones hiding here seem to be the opposition because I think they might be out of things to talk about.
Can we soon move to the question, Mr. Albas?
No, I would just like to have it on the record for prosperity that I always have something to talk about. And and Mr. Speaker, or, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, just on the point. First of all, a prudent use of time would be utilizing the time that we have. Today, I came prepared to listen to our witnesses on a study. We received, what, Friday afternoon? And like I said, perhaps, this would seem reasonable if this came in a month ago. But to be canceling sessions that were already scheduled and witnesses that are already been asked to invite, I find is not a prudent use of time. And second of all, to say we were asked by Canadians to review tax expenditures, so we're not going to ask Canadians about tax expenditures by not allowing the review to go forward, to me is absolutely ridiculous. And I can appreciate that there's going to be a certain amount of spin on all sides, but man, really review that transcript tomorrow and ask yourself, did I really say that?
Okay, are we ready for the question? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. So we met as a steering committee earlier and proposed an agenda going forward. And Susie's going to distribute that there, and we'll go through the calendar and where I think we're at. We'll wait till that calendar's distributed. So on the 8th, which is this Wednesday, we would continue we decided as a steering committee we'd add an extra day on the housing study. And down the road a piece, provide some drafting instructions to the analysts. So on the 8th, we would continue the housing study that has been ongoing the last week or so. And we have 5 or 6 witnesses lined up for that at the moment. On Monday the 13th, on the housing study again, that is the only day that the CEO, the President and CEO of the Canada Mortgage and Housing is available. And so we would invite him to the first hour of that session. The second hour is a little up in the air. The steering committee decided that we would invite the minister and officials for either the 13th or the 15th, if the minister could be available either one of those days. If the minister is not available or can't make himself available, we would have officials on the second hour of the 13th along with the parliamentary secretary. So then on the 15th, if that's the way it occurs, that we have officials on the 13th. There is a view given that the Advisory Committee on Economic Growth has tabled a fairly comprehensive report today. I haven't seen that report as yet, but that we should hold hearings as a committee. There's a motion from Mr. Albas on the record saying that we should hear from various reports, have have hearings on the various reports that the Advisory Council on Economic Growth proposes or tables. So we would start that hearing on the 15th with the Advisory Council on Economic Growth, with a couple of their advisory committee people, if we could, Mr. Barton, if possible, but if not, he's the chair of that advisory committee, and we would go with 2 or 3 council members. The 22nd of February, we would deal in the first hour, on the 22. On the first hour, we would deal with, have Mr. Brian May in on his private member's bill. We think as well during that time that we could, we'd have departmental officials along with Mr. May go to clause-by-clause consideration. And even if we had to, it is a Wednesday, which is a problem with votes, but hopefully we'd be able to squeeze in some the housing market drafting instructions for the analysts, and that is as far as we went. Other than to I should mention as well, on the there is a motion on the books for us to complete a study on the regional development agencies, a report of what they said, etc., in early February. I think there's a feeling we may have to accept with what is in a report already. We talked about it at the subcommittee on the possibility of having some witnesses come in who have had experience in trying to deal with the regional development agencies, but we may be getting into the business of another department and another committee, and I agreed I'll check that out and see what we can do in that area, and if we can, because we can't really prepare a report, or the analysts can't really prepare a report unless we have a little more maybe conflicting evidence in terms of how they operate. So that's at a standstill, just to mention that point. And the last point I'd make coming out of the subcommittee meeting is that people, members need to be thinking about witnesses on that we could pull into the committee if we're to hold further hearings on the Advisory Committee on Economic Growth's proposals, what they think of them, and where the pro-con, whatever, and report back to Parliament. Okay, I think that's basically, unless somebody who was at the subcommittee has anything else to add, we'll go to questions and what your thoughts are on the agenda. Mr. Albas.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly appreciate this being put together in the work of the subcommittee. The only thing I would suggest is that the housing market study here seems to be awfully centered around government agencies, or government and minister in this case. And I do know that there was a lot of desire for further witnesses. Is there a possibility that we could extend more testimony from other groups that would like to come before the committee but have not had the opportunity to?
What's the, it's not up for me to decide, view from around the table. I think what we talked about at the steering committee was having the maybe 1 or 2 more witnesses. There's getting to be a fair bit of repetition. We did talk about possibility of, there was a request from one bank came forward, but we heard from the Canadian Bankers Association, so that covers them. So 1 or 2 more witnesses, minister and officials, was where we ended the discussion at the committee. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, there are 2 things that we must factor, and this was a motion by Mr. McColman previously with the deadline of the end of February. So we have to keep in mind the study limitations and the meeting day limitations. So that's the first thing. And the second is, at the subcommittee, as the chair just said, we went through the list that the clerk has received, or in terms of those interested, and they were relatively the same types of organizations. So we didn't feel that the testimony would be that different. And in my opinion, we have heard from a variety of those affected, and those who have submitted their interest. Again, it's already been established that it is repetitive in terms of types of testimony we would hear. So I think this is a good endpoint, and then with this on the 22nd, drafting our instructions so we can keep on time and moving forward with tabling this report.
Go ahead, Mr.
Just
Ellis.
for the committee's further consideration. Well, what we just argued about shows that when the government wants to change the direction of this committee, we can, because we are technically masters of our own. So for us to have an extra hour or two to make sure we hear from people. And I would also just mindful, we heard from a monoline lender, we heard from the Credit Union Association, we heard from the Banking Association, yes. We heard from an individual mortgage broker, but we did not actually hear from an individual bank or from an individual credit union. And I will say that I've received inquiries from other financial institutions that want to talk about this, because, again, an association is very important for being able to have someone in Ottawa to be able to make representations, but they do not deal with the clients. And I think that that's an important point. So, if the government side is willing to have an extra hour where we can allow some of those voices, absolutely, I agree, we've heard a lot, but to actually talk to people that deal with people on the ground in a highly localized market may actually behoove us rather than an aggregated view.
Any further discussion or any motions to change the schedule? That's allowable. Go ahead, Mr. Sabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've heard a pretty broad swath of the market in terms of all the stakeholders. We've heard some builders. We heard the Canadian Building Association. We heard the Canadian Bankers Association. We're going to, CMHC and CMHC and the CEO of CMHC is going to come visit us. So we are hearing from the participants in the market. I see no need in adding further hours to the study. I think we've actually done a pretty exhaustive job and a great job in asking questions and looking at the issues at hand.
Mr. Caron.
I'm not opposed to the idea of hearing additional witnesses, because there's the case pops of the credit unions and the bankers. But on the 15th, we might have an hour available, on the 13th rather, if the minister is not available. If the officials aren't available on the 13th but can come on the 15th, that would free up at least an hour to hear those witnesses, those groups. So my suggestion would be to hear them if the minister isn't available to appear on the 13th of February.
Go ahead, Mr. Ellis.
I think Mr. Crum makes an excellent suggestion, because the case populaire, maybe we haven't heard from anyone from them. So I'll make the motion that we extend the study by an hour and invite credit unions, case populaire, as well as banks, so that they can round out the study.
Okay, motions on the floor. It is in order because we are on the subject matter. Any further discussion? You're not naming a specific bank representative of the banks. I know the CIBC was one as well. Any further discussion on this on the motion that we extend the study by an hour to hear from several more witnesses, including the bank's case populaire?
They look like they're still thinking it over.
You can hear the wheels turning, eh? Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor of the motion to extend the study by an hour? Yeah. Opposed? Lost. So we will go with the schedule as has been put to the committee. Any further discussion on the schedule? Okay. Any other business?
Is this, did you want to just do a motion to?
Okay. Can we have a motion to adopt the schedule as presented that the clerk handed out? Moved by Mr. Sabero.
Yes.
All those in favor? And Nick? Opposed? Carried. Okay. That, I think, concludes our business. Meeting adjourned.